South Carolina's probate archives hold a will so contentious it was kept from public view for over 8 decades. In March 1857, Colonel Augustus Fairmont composed a document that bequeathed his entire fortune, worth millions in today's currency, to one person alone. He bypassed his wife of 26 years, his 3 acknowledged children, and even the brother who had served with him in the Mexican War. The sole inheritor of Fairmont's 400 acres, his Charleston townhouse, his cotton factoring enterprise, and his extensive investments was a woman whose name in his own account books was listed among his possessions. The unveiling of this will ignited a legal war that engaged 3 law firms, fractured Charleston's high society, and dragged into the light secrets that influential dynasties had spent generations concealing. Before we delve deeper into the tale of Augustus Fairmont and the inheritance that defied all convention, ensure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear and have clicked the notification bell. Accounts like this are scrubbed from the official historical record, and we share them so they are not lost. Let us know in the comments which state you're listening from. We enjoy learning where our audience uncovers these shadowed recesses of the American past. The profound disturbance of the Fairmont case lies not only in the will's contents, but in the hidden realities it forced into the open, revealing the grim foundations underpinning Southern refinement. During the 1850s, Charleston was the perfect portrait of what the antebellum South wished to project. Grand mansions with white pillars stood along the Battery, their wide porches catching the harbor winds. Church bells from St. Michael's and St. Philip's called the congregation to worship, while carriages bearing ladies in silk and gentlemen in fine wool rolled down Meeting Street. This prosperity was built on rice, indigo, and Sea Island cotton, harvested from the vast low country plantations that operated as private fiefdoms. Augustus Fairmont's plantation, Riverside, was situated 30 miles inland on the Ashley River. The central residence, constructed in 1789 by his grandfather, was a three-story Georgian structure whose symmetry and scale communicated permanence and power. Ancient live oaks formed a grand avenue from the river road to the front entrance. Behind the house stood the functional buildings, the kitchen, carriage house, overseer's cottage, and beyond a line of pines, the quarters where nearly 200 enslaved individuals lived, their existence defined in law as property. Fairmont himself was a formidable presence in Charleston. At 47 years old in 1857, he stood over 6 feet tall, carrying himself with a soldier's posture from his service in the Mexican War. He returned with a commendation and a bullet still embedded near his spine that caused a slight limp when the weather turned damp. He served on the vestry of St. Philip's, was a member of the South Carolina Society, the Hibernian Society, and the Agricultural Society. His views on cotton markets influenced traders on Broad Street, and when he spoke at public gatherings about states' rights, people paid attention. His wife, Margaret Louisa Fairmont, belonged to the Rutledge family, part of Charleston's old aristocracy, with all the influential connections that entailed. Her marriage dowry in 1831 was substantial, 30 enslaved individuals, $10,000 in railroad stock, and a surname that guaranteed social access. She had given Augustus 3 children who survived infancy: Catherine, born in 1832, Augustus Jr., born in 1835, and Margaret, called Meg, born in 1838. To the outside world, they were the perfect Southern family, successful, upstanding, and pious. Yet in Charleston, such appearances were meticulously crafted performances, and the Fairmont household maintained its facade with exceptional strictness. The domestic staff at both the plantation and the Charleston townhouse operated under the supervision of a woman named Cellier Russo. In 1857, she was 28, with unusually light skin and the ability to read and write, a perilous combination of traits that would have provoked suspicion in any other home. Fairmont's ledgers recorded her purchase in 1843 from a Savannah estate sale for the remarkable price of $1,500, 3 times the usual amount, with no reason given for the premium. Celia held no formal title, yet she controlled access to Fairmont, handled his correspondence, and occupied a small room in the main house at Riverside instead of the quarters. She dressed in simple but good quality clothing, always wore a gold locket, spoke with the diction of an educated person, and moved through the house with an air of authority that unsettled visitors and made Margaret Fairmont's lips tighten with suppressed fury. The plantation world operated on a set of tacit agreements regarding such situations. Wealthy men often had relationships that remained in the shadows, resulting in children whose parentage was an open secret, never voiced. As long as decorum was preserved, as long as the legal wife's status was unchallenged, as long the children from these unions remained enslaved, as long as the entire structure remained buried beneath a veneer of polite denial, society could continue. Augustus Fairmont was about to shatter every one of these unwritten rules, though no one yet grasped the full extent of his transgression. The spring of 1857 brought an unusual drought to the low country. Rice fields that should have been flooded were cracked and dry. Cotton prices were beginning a slow decline that would spiral into the panic of 1857 by August. In Charleston's parlors, conversation increasingly turned to Northern aggression, the recent Dred Scott decision, and whether the Union could hold. The atmosphere felt heavy, burdened by a world starting to fracture. At Riverside, the strain was more intimate. Margaret Fairmont had returned to Charleston in February with young Meg and had not come back. Catherine, now 25 and unwed, a growing concern, also stayed in the city. Only Augustus Jr., learning his father's trade, made occasional visits, and even he found reasons to keep them short. The household at Riverside was now primarily Augustus, Celia, the field workers, and the immediate domestic staff. It was during this time of relative isolation that Augustus Fairmont began making the arrangements that would demolish his family's understanding of their future. On the evening of March 14, 1857, Augustus Fairmont sent a message to Charleston summoning his attorney, Josiah Prescott, to Riverside. The instruction, delivered by a trusted courier, specified that Prescott should come alone and bring the materials needed to draft a complex last will and testament. Prescott, who had represented the Fairmont family for 15 years, found the request odd but not alarming. Wealthy men often updated their wills. He was unprepared for the scene that awaited him in Fairmont's study 2 days later. Prescott would later testify that he found Fairmont in clear physical distress. The colonel sat behind his mahogany desk, his face ashen and gaunt, one hand pressed to his lower back. A whiskey decanter sat at his elbow, unusual for a man of his usual moderation. Most striking was Celia's presence in the room, not serving, but seated in the leather chair reserved for business associates, her hands folded, her expression calm. "Sir, perhaps I should send for Dr. Middleton," Prescott ventured, noting the sweat on Fairmont's brow despite the cool day. "No doctors," Fairmont's voice was rough but firm. "I know precisely what is wrong with me, Josiah, and no doctor can fix it. I need you to write a will tonight, exactly as I instruct, regardless of what your professional judgment might advise." Prescott glanced at Celia, whose presence made the situation deeply improper. "Colonel, such matters typically require witnesses who can read and write, who can attest to your soundness of mind. Celia is one of the most intelligent people I have ever known." Fairmont interrupted. "She will be a witness. You will find 2 others among my people who can sign their names. I have seen to it." The attorney's unease was palpable, but Fairmont was a client of immense standing. Prescott opened his case and prepared his materials. What followed was a dictation that lasted nearly 3 hours, frequently interrupted as Fairmont struggled through waves of pain. The will started conventionally, with the standard declarations of mental competence and the revocation of prior testaments. Then came the provisions that would append everything. I give and bequeath to Cellier Russo. Fairmont dictated, his words precise despite his suffering, currently held as property at Riverside Plantation, her immediate and unconditional freedom upon my death, along with all documents necessary to establish her status as a free woman of color under the laws of South Carolina and the United States. Prescott's pen hesitated. Clauses granting freedom were not unheard of, though state laws were increasingly restricting them, but Fairmont was only beginning. I further give and bequeath to the aforementioned Cellier Russo, now to be known as Cellier Russo Fairmont, the entirety of Riverside Plantation, including all lands, buildings, equipment, livestock, and all persons currently held in bondage thereon. I further bequeath to her my townhouse at number 14 Trad Street in Charleston, along with all its contents and furnishings. The scratching of the pen ceased entirely. Colonel, I must strongly advise. Fairmont's voice held a sharp edge that brooked no argument. I further bequeath to Cellier Russo Fairmont all shares and interests in the firm of Fairmont and Lazarus Cotton Factors, all railroad stock, all bank deposits, all bonds and securities, and all personal property of every kind and description. I appoint her sole executrix of this, my last will, and testament, with full power to act without bond or judicial oversight. The room fell quiet save for the sound of Prescott's pen and distant evening sounds from the quarters. Celia sat perfectly still. Regarding my wife, Margaret Louise Fairmont, Augustus continued, each word seeming to cost him, I hereby grant her the legal minimum dower right required under South Carolina law. 1/3 of my real property for her natural life. However, said dower right shall be subject to Cellier Russo Fairmont's primary ownership and management, and Margaret Louisa Fairmont shall have no voice in the administration of any property whatsoever. Prescott had stopped pretending to write. Colonel, your wife has legal protections. Your children have expectations. This will not stand in court, beyond the legal impossibilities. A woman of color cannot own, write it down, Josiah, exactly as I say it. Fairmont commanded. There are ways around the legal restrictions, and you know it. Property can be held in trust. Arrangements can be made. I have studied the law. I am not the first man to try to provide for. He stopped. His breathing labored. Write that I acknowledge Celia's son, Daniel, born June 12, 1844, as my natural child, and I direct that he be raised as a free man with all advantages available to him. The silence that followed was profound. Daniel was 13 in 1857, a boy who worked in the stables and bore such a resemblance to Augustus that only willful ignorance could deny the connection. Putting this acknowledgment in writing made explicit what society demanded remain unspoken. Furthermore, Augustus said, his voice weakening, I acknowledge Celia's daughter, Ruth, born April 3, 1847, as my natural child, and I direct that she be raised with the same advantages, 2 children, not a single indiscretion, but a relationship spanning at least 13 years, producing offspring who shared blood with the legitimate Fairmont heirs, but had lived their entire lives as their own father's legal property. Prescott found his voice. Colonel, I cannot in good conscience allow you to proceed without understanding the consequences. Your wife will contest this immediately. Your children will never accept it. Charleston society will. Charleston society. Fairmont interrupted with startling bitterness, built its fortune on systematic rape, and called it breeding stock. Every fine house on the Battery contains children whose fathers own them. Every respectable gentleman conducts business by day and violates the very people he claims as property by night. The only difference, Josiah, is that I am telling the truth about it. I am putting in legal writing what every man in Charleston does in the darkness. He leaned forward, a movement that clearly pained him. I am dying, Josiah. Dr. Middleton told me 6 months ago that the cancer spreading from my bowels would kill me within the year. I've hidden it from everyone but Celia. I have perhaps weeks left, possibly less. And I will not. I cannot leave this earth knowing that my own children will be sold to settle my debts, or that the woman I should have had the courage to marry openly will be returned to bondage when I die. The admission hung in the air. Prescott's hands trembled slightly as he resumed writing. For the next 2 hours, they worked through the technical details, the trust arrangements that might survive legal challenge, the specific bequests for immediate funds, the careful phrasing designed to navigate South Carolina's restrictive laws. When the document was complete, Fairmont read it himself, his finger tracing each line despite his pain. Then he signed with a steady hand. Celia signed as a witness, her handwriting educated and precise. 2 other enslaved individuals from the plantation, Samuel, a blacksmith who had taught himself to read, and Hannah, who had learned letters from a former mistress, were brought in to witness. Prescott recorded their signatures with visible discomfort. I will file this with my other documents, Prescott said carefully as he prepared to leave. But, Colonel, I urge you to reconsider. At least provide more substantially for your legitimate children. Make some gesture that might soften their response. My legitimate children, Augustus said, his voice filled with weariness, will inherit the protection of their mother's family name, the education I have already paid for, and the social position that comes with white skin in Charleston. Daniel and Ruth will inherit nothing but their freedom if I do not act now. The law sees them as things, Josiah. Things I own, things that could be sold to pay my creditors if I do not make this ironclad. He looked at Celia then, and an unspoken understanding passed between them. I have lived a coward's life. Let me at least die honestly. Prescott left Riverside that evening carrying a document he knew would ruin multiple lives, perhaps including his own professional standing. He rode back to Charleston through the dark, wrestling with whether he had a duty to warn Margaret Fairmont. He decided, perhaps cowardly, that attorney-client privilege prevented him from speaking. His silence would allow the situation to unfold with catastrophic results. Augustus Fairmont lived another 6 weeks. He stayed at Riverside, his health failing rapidly. Celia nursed him through increasing pain, administering laudanum, reading to him from books they had apparently shared for years, history, philosophy, poetry. Daniel and Ruth were permitted to visit their father openly in his final days, a sight that scandalized the white overseers, though none dared question it. Margaret Fairmont did not visit. Whether she had heard rumors and chose to stay away, or whether Augustus had prevented word from reaching her, is unclear. She remained in Charleston, attending social functions, maintaining the pretense that her husband was simply occupied with plantation affairs. Augustus Fairmont died on the morning of April 28, 1857. Celia was with him. According to later testimony from the house staff, his final words were, "Tell them the truth." All of it. The truth, when it emerged, would prove more destructive than even he might have imagined. Word of Colonel Fairmont's death reached Charleston that same day. By custom, Margaret received condolences at the Trad Street house. She wore black silk, accepted sympathies with dignity, and everyone remarked on her composure. She had no idea she had already lost everything. The will was read on May 3rd in the drawing room of the Trad Street house. Margaret sat in the largest chair, surrounded by her children, her brother James Rutledge, Augustus's brother William, and a few close family friends. Josiah Prescott arrived carrying the will, looking like a man walking to his execution. He read through the standard openings quickly, then reached the substantive bequests. His voice grew strained as he read the words that freed Celia, acknowledged Daniel and Ruth, and transferred the entire estate to a woman who had been legally considered property when the will was written. The room was first silent, then erupted. Augustus Jr. called it forgery. James Rutledge demanded to know about the witnesses. Margaret remained seated, silent, her face hardening not with shock, with the confirmation of long-held suspicions. Finally, she raised a hand and the room quieted. Her voice was cold and precise. How long? Prescott hesitated. The will acknowledges children born in 1844 and 1847. 13 years, Margaret said softly. My youngest daughter was born in 1838. So, for 19 years of our marriage, she mastered herself with visible effort. And this woman, this Celia, she now owns my home. The will provides for your dower right. 1/3 of the real property for your lifetime. Subject to her ownership and management, she owns the house, Margaret whispered, the words more terrible than any shout. I furnished that plantation. I helped build that business. My dowry helped establish it. And my children inherit nothing. By the will's terms, his acknowledged children received no direct bequests. Augustus J.R. found his voice. This is slavery's revenge. My father went mad. Your father was in full possession of his faculties. Prescott stated firmly. He understood exactly what he was doing. He stated explicitly that he was correcting an injustice. Injustice. Catherine cried, he's made us beggars. James Rutledge stood, his voice shaking with rage. This is unconscionable. It's illegal. A woman of color cannot own property in South Carolina. The property is held in trust with arrangements I believe will withstand legal challenge. Prescott said. Colonel Fairmont studied the law extensively. Margaret stood, and her posture silenced the room. Where is she now? Prescott was visibly reluctant. She remains at Riverside with the children, as the will specifies as her right. Her right, Margaret repeated, tasting the word like poison. Send word to her. Tell her the family wishes to discuss the terms. Tell her we may be prepared to reach an accommodation to avoid a public contest. Tell her, she paused, her smile terrible, tell her I wish to meet my husband's other family. The message was sent. Celia agreed to come to Charleston, but only with her lawyer present at Prescott's office and with Daniel and Ruth accompanying her. The meeting was set for May 8th. In 5 days between the reading and the meeting, Charleston society ignited with scandal. The details leaked. Soon, everyone in polite circles knew that Colonel Fairmont had freed his enslaved mistress, acknowledged their children, and disinherited his white family. Reactions were divided, but beneath the outrage ran an undercurrent of fear. If a man like Fairmont could do this, what did it say about the stability of their own arrangements? The will had to be defeated. The meeting on May 8th in Prescott's office was tense and crowded. Margaret arrived with her family and 2 new attorneys. When Celia entered with her children, the effect was immediate. She wore a simple, well-made dark gray dress, her hair pulled back. Daniel in a tailored suit and Ruth in a neat blue dress, both bore the unmistakable Fairmont features. Margaret spoke first, her voice controlled. You understand. I presume that my husband's will cannot stand. The law protects a wife's rights. No court in South Carolina will allow this. Celia met her gaze directly, a violation of social code. I understand that your husband chose to acknowledge the truth. Finally, the simple statement landed like a physical blow. Margaret's composure cracked. You seduced him, used your position to manipulate. I was 14 years old when your husband purchased me in Savannah. Celia's voice remained level but gained intensity. 14. I didn't seduce anyone. I was taught to read and write, which made me valuable as a household manager. That's what he told people. He bought me for the truth about what else I was purchased for, what I had no choice about. I assume you can imagine. The room fell silent. You will not speak to my mother that way. Catherine said, her voice shaking. You have no right to. I have every right. Celia turned to her, steel in her tone. I have the right your father gave me in his will. I have the right of someone who managed your household, helped raise you when you were young, kept your father's books, ran his affairs when he was away, and bore his children just as your mother did. The only difference is that I did all of it without choice, without legal protection, without the ability to say no. And now your father has tried to give me what he should have given me 13 years ago, my freedom and the means to protect my children. Margaret's attorney, an older man named Bogard Simmons, interjected, Miss Russo, your personal history is not relevant. The will violates South Carolina law. Property cannot be transferred in this manner to a woman of color. Children born of an enslaved mother are themselves enslaved and cannot inherit. The dower rights of the legal wife supersede any testamentary provisions. This will is legally invalid. Then why are we having this meeting? Celia asked. If you're so confident, why not simply proceed to court? The truth was more complex. The legal landscape was a patchwork, and a public battle would expose details neither family wanted examined. James Rutledge cleared his throat. We recognize that a court case would be unpleasant for all involved. Names would be named, children would be scrutinized. We are prepared to offer you a settlement, your freedom, which the law would likely grant regardless, and $20,000 to establish yourself and your children in the North. In exchange, you renounce all claims to the Fairmont properties and leave South Carolina within 30 days. The offer was substantial, but a fraction of the estate's worth, requiring exile. Your husband left me everything because he knew what would happen to us if he didn't, Celia said quietly. He knew I would become vulnerable, that his children would be treated as property. He spent 6 weeks dying in agony, ensuring we would be protected. I don't believe he would want me to accept 30 pieces of silver and disappear. How dare you quote scripture at me? Margaret's voice was a hiss. You who helped destroy my marriage. She fought for control. Did you love him? The question transformed the legal negotiation into something raw and human. Celia's composure cracked slightly. I was 14 when he bought me, Mrs. Fairmont. I learned to survive. Whether that became love or simply the need to protect my children, I don't know if I can answer that, but I do know that he gave me the only gift he could, the chance to not be property anymore. And if I surrender that, my children will spend their lives vulnerable to anyone who decides their freedom is inconvenient. The meeting ended with no agreement. The battle would move to court. The legal fight consumed Charleston for the next 18 months. The case, Fairmont v. Fairmont Estate, was presided over by Judge Hamilton Pinckney. Then, the Panic of 1857 struck, causing a national financial crisis that devastated the Fairmont estate's value. Celia, with her lawyer Thomas Grimball, a Quaker opposed to slavery, made ruthless decisions to save the estate from foreclosure, including selling enslaved people to raise cash. This gave Margaret's attorneys ammunition, but Grimball argued their objection was not to the act of selling people, but to who had the power to do it. Witness testimony proved explosive. A cook testified that Augustus was different, with Celia quieter. Like he could rest. Dr. Middleton testified that Augustus was of sound mind and had explicitly stated he was tired of lying, that the greatest crime was purchasing Celia and fathering children into bondage. In January 1858, Celia's daughter, Ruth, fell gravely ill with scarlet fever. When Margaret's attorneys argued Celia could not use estate funds for the child's care, Judge Pinckney ruled that a child would not die, while lawyers argued property rights. Public sympathy began to subtly shift. In March 1858, Thomas Grimball played his final card. He introduced into evidence manumission papers from 1844 and 1847, proving Celia and her children had been legally free for over a decade. Augustus had secretly freed them, but maintained the fiction of ownership to protect them. Ruth had never been enslaved. The revelation was catastrophic for Margaret's case. If Celia was free, the will was a simple transfer between free persons. Judge Pinckney's eventual ruling granted Margaret her dower right, but gave Celia control of the rest of the estate. The appeals court let the ruling stand. Celia had won, but victory was hollow. Margaret exercised her right to live in Trad Street house, creating an unbearable living situation for 2 years before she finally left to live with her brother. She never spoke her husband's name in public again. The Civil War destroyed what remained of the Fairmont fortune. Riverside was ransacked. The business collapsed, but Celia and her children survived. They moved to Philadelphia before the war. Daniel became a carpenter, Ruth a teacher. They married, had families, and lived as free people. Celia died in 1889 and was buried under a headstone that read simply, Celia Russo Fairmont, 1008, 119-1008, 189. Free, the case was largely purged from legal textbooks, too uncomfortable for the historical record. But the documents survived, a testament to a man who tried to correct an injustice from beyond the grave, and in doing so, revealed the corrupting poison of a system that defined human beings as property. His will did not fix what was broken, it simply showed in stark relief how broken it all was.